Hi, I'm Dunaway. I'm the general surgeon that invented risk-based coding. And I'm here today to show you three things. One, I'd like to simplify E&M coding. This is not a substitute for a coding seminar. Aren't you happy about that? I will hit the high points because that's really all you need to know. Then I'm going to illustrate how risk-based coding actually works. This is the system that I developed in 1997 and published my first book in 1998 about. And then I'd like to explain how E&Minator, our new iOS app, will make you money, save you time, give you credit and recognition, and allow you to never fear a third-party payer auditor again. And it is all based on risk-based coding. It starts off with a coding experience I had in a coding seminar. Y'all been to one of them? A lot of fun, I know. But when I went to this coding seminar, not by choice, I discovered that it was a coder that was giving the demonstrations and explaining to me how to become a better coder. Well, I'm not interested in being a better coder. But I did have a question. I said, when an auditor looks at our charts, what exactly are they looking at? And they gave me the coder's perspective, which also happens to be the same as an auditor's perspective. When an auditor looks at one of your charts, what they're looking at is they look at the chart and they see words. They see paragraphs, they see sentences, they see the things that we've written down that they're assessing to make sure we are okay. Which is fine, but it's not a physician's perspective. So I kept asking, what exactly is an auditor looking for? And they showed me how an auditor actually does this. And I'm going to illustrate it here for you. First of all, an auditor will look at what you've written down, but the first thing they look at is the code that you chose. So, the first step is they look at the E&M code. That E&M code, we're going to put it right here. That's the first thing they look at. You determine the code, that's what you're billing for, so the code is king. The second thing they look for is they look for where was this service performed? What location was used when they did the assessment? So, here's what they look for then. They look for a service location. Once they have the service location, if the service location matches with the code that you submitted, you're off the hook so far. If it doesn't, there's a problem with the matchup, then you've got some troubles. Most people get this without too much difficulty because it's not too hard to figure out where you were when you saw your patient. The next step changes a little bit, and that comes into something that we all know about. They look at the history and the physical. So they look at the history. And once they look at the history, what they're trying to do is figure out if the history and the physical have the appropriate documentation to match up with the code. Well, you can see that's not very difficult to consider. And then there's a third component called medical decision making. Now, medical decision making, we know what a history is, we know what a physical is, but medical decision making, what exactly is medical decision making? Well, we'll talk about that. Medical decision-making is a key component. There are three key components to every E&M code you choose. Now, depending on circumstances, if you have a patient that's an established patient, if you have a patient that's a new patient, and depending on where you are, there are all sorts of different histories to do. There's comprehensive, detailed, problem-focused, expanded problem-focused, and then, of course, there's comprehensive, interval exam as well as detailed interval exam. You get the picture, and we're not going into all of that. But there are lots of variations in the history. And then, of course, when you get to the physical, those are all the bullet points we all love, right? Well, we're not getting into the weeds on this. I just want to show you how an audit is conducted. So they check off your history component. They check off your physical exam component. And then they also look for something called medical decision making. And as a physician, what's medical decision making? Medical decision making is when I look for someone that needs surgery and say, I can't operate on you because I'm going to kill you. That, to me, is medical decision making. But that's not really. That's a part of it. There's a component of it. But medical decision making is also composed of three key components. The first component is risk. So when you look at the components of medical decision making, what you're really looking at is you're looking at risk, You're also looking at data, and the third component is diagnoses. So what happens is when you take the medical decision making and you are actually looking at three key components of the medical decision making. Risk, which there are risk tables for just about every patient encounter you might have. There is a risk considered with that. And as much as of a hard time as I give third-party payers, they've really done a bang-up job with the risk tables. It's just that most physicians have never seen them. Well, I have, and that's your advantage. Also, we have data. What's data? Labs and stuff, chest x-rays, medical studies. These are all data points. And those are also tabulated. When an auditor comes through, they tabulate your risk, they add up your data points, and they tabulate data, and they also look at the number of diagnoses or management options any patient presents with. So these three key components, risk, data, and diagnosis, all go together to create, ultimately, the decision if you are going to be given a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If you're given a thumbs down, that's where the audits and fines and everything that you really want to avoid come in. If you're given a thumbs up, that means you're going to be paid, it's successful, an auditor will be happy with you. Well, that's how it works. That's how an auditor looks at your information. But there's a little bit of a difference here. It's a little bit of a difference, and I want to talk about two special components out of all of these components here. The first one I want to talk about is this medical decision making. Now remember, with medical decision making, there are three key components that make up an E&M code: history, physical, medical decision making. But of these three, medical decision making is special. So, to acknowledge how special that is, we've given medical decision making a crown. So we'll put medical decision making up here because it now recognizes how special medical decision making is. Now the reason this is special is because when you have any documentation, history, physical, medical decision making, you can imagine if a patient came into your clinic with a hangnail and you did a large history and a large physical examination on that hangnail, technically you could charge at a higher rate. Don't do that. That's called fraud. Medical decision making is an absolute. You either qualify for it or you don't. There's no making things up with medical decision making. Well, that's not entirely true. But of these three, history, physical, medical decision making, of these three, medical decision making is the greatest. And the OIG, more importantly, understands that this is the greatest. And as a result, when an auditor is looking, they are paying special attention to medical decision making. Now, when we look at risk, data, and diagnosis, again, those are the three key components that you're looking at for medical decision making: risk, data, and diagnosis. One of those is also special. Can you guess which one? Obviously, it's going to be the one that we are least familiar with. It's risk. And we're going to give risk the crown that it so richly deserves also. So we're just going to substitute this risk to emphasize how important that is. At this point, that's how the whole system works. Risk is important because, again, it is something you can't make up. You could order all sorts of extra data points. You could order a chest x-ray on everybody that comes in with a sneeze for the day, which would be driving up your score to get a higher medical decision making. Don't do that. That's fraud. For diagnoses, you could count every single diagnosis the patient has, including a mosquito bite, to add up points to drive to a higher medical decision making. Don't do that. That is fraud. But risk either is or is not. And that's what's beautiful about risk, because once you figure out risk is important, medical decision making is important, the way an auditor looks at this, it doesn't give any special credence to either one of those, although they know those are important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a physician's perspective. When a patient comes in and we have the chart, when the auditor gets the chart, it has everything written in it. It's got sentences, it's got words, but when a physician looks at a chart, when we open up a chart where we have the patient in the room, we're not looking at the same chart, we are looking at blank pages because we have not written anything down yet. And that's the difference between the physician's perspective, a clinician's perspective, and an auditor's perspective. It's a very substantial difference between the two. When we look at this, I want you to understand we are now going to talk about something called the commutative property. Do you remember the commutative property from math? We've all taken calculus. We know what this is. This is A plus B equals B plus A. You see, all of these have to add up to the right answer or you get in compliance trouble. Well, we're going to use all of these components, except we're just not going to add them up the same way an auditor adds them up. We're going to construct our documentation by a different methodology. And this methodology is the fundamental basics of what I called risk-based coding that I developed in 1997 and wrote my first book in 1998 about. So let's take a look at this. We're going to do a little rearranging. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to move this arrow over here to the center. That gets it all lined up nicely, I think. And then we've got the E&M code, which thinks it's king. Well, actually it is, but it's not the same king that it thinks it is. We're going to move this and just place this to the side, just for a few minutes. We don't need the E&M right now. Then we're going to take these three key components, risk. We're going to put risk up here. Risk is king. Risk is driving this system. That's why it's called risk-based coding. We're going to take data, again, putting it up here. There's our data perspective, right next to risk, and diagnosis is going to sit right next to that. So that's risk, data, and diagnosis. Now, location is not important just yet, but we're not going to get rid of it. We're just going to place it to the side just for a few minutes. Now, we're going to take medical decision making, also the king, and we're going to put medical decision making in this location. Well, gosh. At this point, we really don't need history and physical here. Now again, we're not getting rid of them. We're using the same components. We are just rearranging them a bit. When we do this, it makes room for location. We're going to put location to be examined next as we construct our documentation. So location is in this position. And once we have location there, now we're going to move the E&M code, which is very important, but it's not important in how we construct our documentation until toward the very end of the steps. Now we have history and physical, which will fall literally and figuratively right here for history, and then for physical, it'll come down here. Let me tell you what we've just done. We have taken this and we've rearranged how this is perceived. We've rearranged how it's arranged. It's the same components, we've just rearranged it a different way. This illustrates how risk-based coding works. Let me explain. When a patient comes in to see you, you determine risk. Now there are ways to determine risk. You don't need to know them because we now have it available in an app. But before, you'd have to go through my little book and have to figure out from the table of risks all the different risks that a patient could have, and you'd have to pick one. Then we'd get you to add up data points. Data and diagnoses are scored. These data and diagnoses are scored, and you have to add them up, score them, and then once you had risk, data, and diagnosis, that led you to a medical decision-making step. Once you had medical decision-making, you had a limited number of codes that you were going to choose from. Because the three key components of a code, medical decision-making, history, and physical, by knowing your medical decision-making, it's already limited your codes basically from 4 to 1 choice. From all the codes down to a quarter of the codes. And the final determinant is knowing where the location is. So once I know risk, data, and diagnosis, which gives me medical decision-making coupled with where I am seeing this patient lead me to one code, one single code. In that respect, the E&M code is king, but it's only one code now. So what we've done is we've taken this systematic approach that an auditor uses, but we've changed it around to make it work our way. By understanding what the E&M code is, we are then given information to say what history and physical will support this code. Now, like I said, this gets very complicated, but the beauty of this is you don't have to know about the complicating parts because that's all self-working once you engage this system. This system is exactly how E&Minator works. But instead of having to look up in tables and to calculate values and to remember those values, it is all self-working. E&Minator will ask you a question that you can select your risk from. It will ask you what data points you're about to order or that you've reviewed. It will talk about diagnoses, and all of this is just a finger touch on the touch screen. That will generate a medical decision-making determination that you're not even aware of because you don't need to. Then it will ask you, where are you seeing this patient? And then it will present you with your code and exactly what you have to document. Whether you have to document all of a history and all of a physical, or part of one or part of another, or this many bullets or that many bullets or this many perspectives, if it's comprehensive, if it's detailed, all these things that drive us crazy is just given to you directly from the programming. And that's what's so incredible about the iOS system that my partner Jerry Edens developed for this. He took the principles of risk-based coding and then we put it into an app so it is all self-working. There is no heavy lifting. You don't have to understand anything about coding or documentation. But you see, you've used all these different components, but you haven't taken anything away. Well, actually, that's incorrect. See this one? We can get rid of this. Because if you use this approach, you will always get a green thumbs up because it's been designed to be compliance correct, work first time, every time. I'd like to explain to you how EMinator works. I really don't know. Jerry knows how the software works, but I can tell you the results. And the results are you end up having the correct code for every patient encounter, any evaluation and management service, and it then tells you exactly what you have to document to support that code. Now again, there's a difference between supporting a code and justifying a code. The compliance correct methodology allows us to determine the compliance correct E&M code based on risk and medical decision making as driving forces. It doesn't neglect anything else, it just knows where the OIG auditors are inspecting very closely. In doing so, it'll generate an E&M code and then tell you how to support that code with the documentation. It will not allow you to justify the code with documentation. If you justify your codes with documentation, that gets you on the slippery slopes where you're doing enormous histories and physicals for people with hangnails, and that will get you in trouble. Our system is available right now at the Apple App Store. We have a website, www.em-inator.com. On that website, you will find instructional videos. You might have found this one, but you'll also see demonstrations of how our app works. If this isn't the best money you've ever spent in coding, I don't know what is. We've made all the heavy lifting so easy through the application. Thank you so much for taking the time to checking us out. Thank you.